Hello, everyone. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies here at Princeton University. And welcome to another episode of our Wednesday webinars. One of these days, very soon, hopefully we have these webinars turned back into seminars so we can have you here in person, both our guests and our audiences. And often we offer lunch as well, so we can eat, we can talk, and we can see each other in person under one roof, hopefully next fall. Before I start, let me thank two people who make these series possible. Becky Parnian, our events coordinator, and Pete Novak, who offers IT support for these series. A couple of logistics before I introduce the panel today. We would have three presenters today, and each of them would talk for around 10 to 15 minutes, introducing the topic. And then after that, a short conversation amongst them, after which I would open the Q&A session. You can submit your questions through the link on the lower right side of your screen that says Q&A. You submit your questions, and I would read your questions and pose them to our guests. Today's conversation, Formations of Translation in Contemporary Iran, is the brainchild of our own Milad Odabaei, and it's about in post-revolutionary Iran. And as many of us know, she is seminarians, theorists of the Islamic State, and the middle classes well-versed in English, engaged in reading and translating Western literature and philosophy, despite vast ideological differences between and among them. Since the 1990s, Iran has witnessed an unprecedented rise in the translation of continental philosophy and social theory. Translators have emerged as important political actors, celebrated by some as intellectual vanguards who push back against authoritarianism, and condemned by others as agents of Western cultural imperialism. To talk about these issues, Dr. Odabaei has invited two guests, but before introducing them, let me say a few words about Milad himself. Milad Odabaei is a postdoctoral fellow at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. His research brings together the study of history and tradition, translation and migration, as well as loss and revolution. Milad's current book project is a critical and anthropological reflection on proliferation of practices of reading and translating of continental philosophy and social theory in Iran after the 1979 revolution. His research appears in comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, How, the Journal of Ethnographic Theory, Iranian Studies, and Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1906 and Narratives of Enlightenment. Our guests who so generously accepted Milad's invitation, Esmaeil Haddadian-Moghaddam, Izemari Skolodovska, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Corey Actions Research Fellow at Leiden University. Previously, he was at the University of Leuven, both as a postdoctoral and research fellow. Dr. Haddadian-Moghaddam is the author of Literary Translations in Modern Iran, a sociological study which came out in 2014. His numerous articles traverses the fields of Iranian and Persian studies, translation and intellectual studies, and intercultural studies, world literature and culture, cultural Cold War. His current research focuses on the dynamics, legacy, and impact of cultural Cold War in the Middle East. Professor Hosna Sheikholeslami is an assistant professor at Denison University. She is an anthropologist whose research interests include political and economic anthropology, and anthropology of knowledge and translation. She's currently working on her first book manuscript based on 2 years of field work in Tehran, and manuscript examines how and why knowledge travels transnationally by examining the production of translated texts of Western human sciences in Iran, with particular attention to the mediating labors of translators, publishers, and censors. It's a privilege for us to host 2 guests, and with many thanks to Milad Odabaei for convening and organizing this panel, which promises to sort of pose interesting questions and engage with quite substantive conversations about the formations of translation in Iran. So the screen is yours, Milad, and I disappear and reappear later for question and answers. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Behruz, for always generous introductions. And thank you, Becky and Pete, for your support in planning and conducting this event. I also want to thank Dr. Haddadian-Moghaddam and Dr. Sheikholeslami, Esmaeil and Hosna for accepting our invitations and joining us to speak about translation in contemporary Iran, a topic that I think is important, somewhat understudied, and if researched, has a potential to change the common perception of modern Iran and conversations about it. Let me say at the outset that there are several other scholars in and on the margins of Iranian studies whose work directly or indirectly addresses translation and reception of European discourses in Iran. I've been in conversation with a number of them and hope that we can continue these conversations in the future iterations of this event and also in other venues. But today I'm extremely excited to be in conversations with Esmaeil and Hosna. Esmaeil is the author of the first systematic The Study of Translation in Iran in the English Language, Literary Translation in Modern Iran, a sociological study, as Behruz mentioned. His book, as the title suggests, is focused on literary translation, but it charts out the history of translation from the Qajar period to the present and elaborates on the infrastructure of translation and publishing industries, on censorship and the entanglement of translation with social and political critique that affect all forms of translation in contemporary Iran. Today, after my short introduction, we will begin with Esmaeil and get a historical perspective on the present before we turn to Hosna and have a conversation among us and then with the audience. I first met Hosna in Tehran when we were both conducting research in 2014, and it has been wonderful to be in conversation with her since. Like myself, Hosna is an anthropologist and currently working on her first manuscript, which is titled Infrastructures of Imaginaries, Translation, Publication, and Politics of Western Theory in Iran. Today, she will draw on this research and on her writing and offer ethnographic theorization of translation infrastructure composed of translators, publishers, and censors. So let me begin by drawing on my own study of translation and offer some remarks that touch on method as well as stakes of translation and its study in Iran. And hopefully this will, some of these themes will emerge also in our conversation. In thinking about translation of European literary and theoretical discourses in Iran, I want to note the limit of the conventional approaches that fix Europe, Iran, and attendant texts and archives in time and place, and consider translation as an immediate transfer of meaning across pre-constituted a priori histories and geographies. Even when such approaches are staged as a critique of colonialism and Orientalism of representation, they risk interpreting religion, language, and culture as part of a simple racialized national and civilizational epistemology, where Iran is the inheritor of static and timeless Islamic and Persianate discursive traditions, and Europe is the sole protagonist of modernity's discourses of self and society. Drawing on critique of positivism and historicism in critical anthropology of religion, politics, and ethics, and in conversations with the studies of Persianate discourses, such as those of Setrag Manoukian and Manakia, I want to suggest that methods of reading and translation are best understood as embodied practices that take part in creation of novel ethical and political contexts. In other words, translation is not just something that happens in a context, but takes part in creation of contexts. The translation of European literary and theoretical discourses in Iran can be understood as creation of Iran, where Iran is what Reinhard Koselleck would call a distinct space of experience and horizon of expectation, or what David Scott identifies as a distinct problem space. Indeed, today in Iran, the significance of translation is debated in these very terms. For example, critical theorist Milad Odabaei conceptualizes Iran as a space of translation that is produced at the intersection of four traditions, namely Islam, Persianate adab, Greek philosophy as it has been translated and transmitted to Islamic and Iranian milieus, as well as a specifically modern tradition whose conceptual universe is made accessible through the Iranian encounter with modern Europe and European discourses. This last tradition is one that, unlike others, is without a foundational discursive basis. One way to think of translation in Iran today is as the creation of discursive basis of tajaddud, modernity, as a philosophical tradition that can be debated on its own terms. The social and political developments of modern Iran, as well as events such as the Constitutional Revolution and the Islamic Revolution, can be understood at the intersection of these very traditions and not simply reduced to colonial dialectic within the West. So, for example, we can approach the Constitutional Revolution as part of the history of constitutionalism, as opposed to reifying constitutionalism as European and thinking of Iranian constitutionalism to be produced as a mimetic production of European forms. There are also critical currents of thinking in Iranian studies that point in the same direction. One notable example is Mohammad Tawakkoli Targhi's account of Persianate modernity. His account rejects simple narratives that conceive of modernization as westernization and emphasizes the place of European discourses in articulation of modern Iran. Afsaneh Najmabadi points in a similar direction when she addresses the translation of modern discourses of sexuality and gender, categories of sex and gender, in the enactment of gendered and sexual selves in Iran. The analytic focus on translation has the potential to theorize the encounter of multiple traditions, not simply by advancing a liberal model of exchange, hybridity, or diversity, but as a political problematic that requires working through. Translation, in other words, is part of the process of encountering different embodied traditions and working through their incommensurabilities and disharmonies. Moreover, while practices of translation in Iran occupy a long-standing contrastive sub-fashioning of Iranian society vis-a-vis Europe, they bring forth intellectual and political pursuits that exceed colonial dialectics. As such, the study of translation in Iran has the potential to move us away from post-colonial debates on modernization as westernization, which are also echoed in anti-colonial discourses of Gharb-zadegi or Westoxification in Iran. Ethnographic and historiographic encounters with practices of translation are opportunities to participate in conversations and debates that produce modern Iranian society in theory and practice. Even in a situation where Islam has been reconceived as an anti-Western social and national ideology, we see Islamic revolutionaries and statespersons take up translation to defamiliarize themselves from their respective debates and pose new questions about the situation, unprecedented situation in which they find themselves. During my research in Iran, for example, I spent a significant amount of time with clerics that came of age around the time of the revolution and during the Cultural Revolution. As you know, the goal of the Cultural Revolution that immediately followed the event of the revolution was to purge the universities from poisonous discourses of the West, to modernize Shia seminaries, and to produce what Iranian state continues to call Islamic human sciences and Islamic social sciences. A state policy supported young seminarians to enter the post-revolutionary academy, to study social and political sciences, and to produce discursive basis of a modern Islamic state. Today, these clerics and their students, who are also sociologists and political theorists, extensively read and translate the social sciences along with traditional curriculum of the seminaries in their pedagogy, their research, and their writing. I have written, for example, how one of my interlocutors that I've described as the last Islamic revolutionary would invite his students to engage European discourses of political theology, the writing of Carl Schmitt or Emmanuel Levinas, to examine their attachment to velayat faqih, the rule of the Shia jurist, as the founding principle of Islamic government. Alternatively, there are Foucauldian clerics who denaturalize contemporary Islamic politics with genealogy and archaeology, historicizing tradition and highlighting its different political possibilities. On the one hand, seminarian academics who occupy Iranian universities and the research centers and education centers of the Shia seminaries in Qom inherit and extend the revolutionary dream of creating a modern Islamic society. But on the other, through their engagement with translation, they relate to the limitation of inherited traditions in making sense of historical circumstance. Discursive limitation, which make their appearance in historical events as happened with the revolution and as it happens in cycles of unrest in Iran today, are generatively displaced and engaged in practices of translation as attempts to activate the imaginative and speculative capacities of language and discourse towards yet unknown future. I suppose I'm saying while translation is recruited to various political programs, within various political ideologies, it also has an effect of opening political discourse beyond those reified ideologies towards futures that are not already constituted, they're undetermined. The relation between the limit of inherited traditions and translation of European discourses is at times theatrical. It becomes a stage as Iranian politics. One example is that of a show trial and the persecution of reformist politician Saeed Hajjarian after the Green Movement. Hajjarian defended himself against the charge of sedition by saying how he was forced to translate European theorists such as Max Weber, Jürgen Habermas, and Talcott Parsons, because there is no ready-made blueprint for creating and governing a modern Islamic society. To deflect the charge of sedition and appease the court, he engaged in the exegesis of Weberian theories of traditional authority and argued that he had made an interpretive mistake. He then directly addressed the translation of European theories and failures of the Cultural Revolution as the cause of political unrest in Iran. This is not to reify what he says, but to recognize that his performance and linking of translation and political unrest tells us something about the role of translation in the constitution of Islamic politics today. The translation of theoretical discourses by seminarian academics is the continuation of politics of Islamic revolution. And yet translation is also a reckoning with the limitations of earlier theological and political paradigms that manifested as revolutionary politics. Translation responds to the limits of contemporary political discourse by relating to a condition of illegibility and unknowing that the Lebanese artist Jalal Tawfiq diagnoses as the withdrawal of tradition in the context of political violence and defeat, or what Tabatabai theorizes as the realization of epistemological limit of inherited traditions. In confronting this very illegibility of contemporary experience of society and politics, lay and learned Iranians turn to the translation of various theoretical discourses as a form of social and political activism. This form of activism is encouraged, particularly because direct criticism of religious and political authority in Iran is risky. The emergence of translation as a form of activism is also one of its limitations. Translation is often performed by translators who have little or no scholarly training or institutional support, and they sometimes lack the mastery of multiple languages that they traverse. Nonetheless, the stakes and potentiality of translation lies in expanding the philosophical and imaginative capacities of Persian language for the development of theoretical discourse and debate, including debates about translation itself. Thank you so much. I hope that some of what I've said will resonate or emerge in conversations, but I will stop now and hand it over to Esmaeil for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Milad, for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm very happy and honored to be here. I think I couldn't put it better than you. So you kind of did my work. You introduced the book and you told me what the book is about. I don't know what I should say. And add to that, I haven't prepared anything written, or haven't really put together some clear ideas that could make sense. So I kind of try to recall some of the ideas that I cover in the book that could be probably relevant to the event. As you said, the book that came out in 2014 was the result of course, a PhD thesis that I did at my university in Spain. And when I started working on that research towards my PhD, I came with the deep interest in literature translation because literature translation has been really the dominant discourse of translation in Iran, due to the fact that the literature translator enjoy high symbolic capital or prestige. So I came with that idea, of course, and once I started to read and research a little bit about the topic, I realized that I had to do some sociology of some sort. So gradually, within my framework, I started to look at what was a couple of years active in translation studies, about 6 years or 5. Actually, it was just beginning in 2006, I think, where the first articles and publication in sociology of translation appeared. And I found it quite interesting to look at the case of Iran from the perspective of sociology. And of course, due to the fact that Bourdieu is such a popular sociologist and his ideas seem to be so relevant, after reading Bourdieu for some time, I tried to apply Bourdieu's sociology to the case of Iran. Of course, I'm not trained in sociology, even though I have a degree in anthropology as well. But I never followed and continued with anthropology. It was just a short period of time, a year in Sweden, when I did anthropology also. And I used that ideas when I did do some fieldwork in Iran. Of course, that helped. But anyway, once I started to read about the case and I started to research, I realized that I cannot cover everything. So I had to limit myself to the literature translation, because the field of translation in Iran is an uncharted territory, and you cannot cover everything. As you know, in order to be focused, you have to select a certain object for your study. Some of the reviews that have been published on my books mention that there are shortcomings here and there, and those are because I was entering a territory which hasn't been explored, at least in English. We have quite a good number of articles and publication and translation in Iran in Persian, but until very recently that we have seen increasing number of publications in English coming from Iran by scholars who are stationed in Iran, or by quite a number of graduates who have studied translation in universities across the world. And so a body of literature has started to appear, including recent translation of Milad Odabaei's article, Tafakkur Tarjumeh, which just recently came out. But this article has been there, I think, about 20 years or so, but wasn't introduced to the broader public. So in order to be focused on an object, control object, I had to focus on literature translation. And I drew on sociology of Bourdieu, and I used certain concept of sociology. As you said, I tried first to chart the history of translation from the Qajar till the present time, because that was necessary to cast the analysis into a historical background framework. And then I covered several case studies, each of them from a certain period of time. And those who have studied the book, they know that I moved from Haji Baba, the Adventures of Haji Baba, and I finished with interview with a number of Iranian women translators. So I tried to present an overview of the field of translation in Iran. I included, or I consider field of translation as a subfield of publishing field. And it's still, if you follow Bourdieu's analysis, publishing field is by itself a subfield of field of cultural production. So we come from this broader field of culture and we move towards books and translation. Within that framework, I look at the publishers and a number of translators and I interviewed them. I have textual analysis, I have interviews, I have survey. And the idea behind all of this was to find out three important things. First was, how do they make a decision? Based on what criteria they decide what text to translate, yes? Why this one and why not that one? And then the second was what motivates them. And then the last one was what constraints, or what factors constrain their agency, because the concept of agency was quite recent in translation studies. And I proposed a model in order to analyze the data they collected to see what constraints and what increases their agency. So through several case studies, I came to the conclusion that if you have also read the article that I and my friend colleagues Milad Odabaei wrote on translation and Persian tradition, we said that, and the case studies shows, majority of case studies shows that translation in Iran is translator oriented. And this is in sharp contrast to Western tradition, where publishers usually and agents commission works for translation. But in Iran, the majority of the cases, at least until the last couple of years, was that translators always act as the selector of titles for translation. What motivates them, this is where Bourdieu comes into the picture. Are they after money, or they're after prestige, or they're after some other reasons? Yeah? So it's a combination of these things play a role. And then what constrains them, this is where the topic of censorship comes. Of course, it has a great impact of the practice of translators in Iran. But what I tried to show in my analysis was that it's not always constraining. Censorship can have a reverse effect on the practice of translation in Iran. I showed through some of the cases that some of the translators have used this censorship, and they have applied certain kind of what I've called, and of course, I think it's in Bourdieu, he calls that coping strategies. So they try to avoid the titles and the books that might get censored. So they opt for classics. They try to find works which have lower chances of censorship, and they can bypass the Momayezi, what they call censorship, the censorship they call Momayezi in Iran, in order to get the book published. So I try to show that censorship is not always constraining. So again, the translator have learned through practice and error to go against that. The objective, after all this analysis, was to show that the story of translation in Iran is a much more complex than it appears. It needs more attention. The translator in Iran are highly visible. There is this high concentration of symbolic capital following Bourdieu. And because of that, translation is important. Of course, that the importance of translation and visibility of translator, to follow Lawrence Velotti argument, has certain consequences. One of those consequences, it might mean that there is a sharp lack of, a serious lack of what you and Hosna might be interested to explore further. That means there is an absence of something. There is, on the one hand, there is this high concentration of symbolic capital and high prestige for translators, but that visibility means there is an invisibility of something. I think about a year ago, 2 years ago, a PhD student, which I had the honor of judging the thesis, she wrote on visibility of translator of children book in Iran. And that idea came up there again. And she argued and she went against the idea of invisibility of translator, and she showed how visible translators in Iran are. And one of the things that I discussed this with her and I commented on the thesis was the fact that that should tell us something. And I think that ties in with the discussion that you brought in, which I found fascinating to explore, is the idea that how translation has been used as a tool by the seminarians and the theologians in Iran, the state theologians, to sustain the status quo. Yeah, And I found that interesting. That should also tell something about this, how translation has been viewed in Iran, both as an empowering tool for translators and women, but also as an empowering tool for seminarians that you mentioned and you covered in just short presentation. I found it fascinating. But again, I think overall, my research and focus on that literature translation in Iran kind of was the start of a process that it's been about 8 years now since the book was published, and I've seen people starting to read and follow some of the areas for further research that I mentioned in the book, and I'm happy that the book has started gradually to show and have an impact. And one of the things that you followed and I found it very fascinating is the fact that a sociological approach to translation can open up further areas for research, including your own work and Hosna, which I'm looking forward to read and know more and learn more about that. I cut here because I think I went above my time parameters. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be in conversation with both of you, and I'm sort of smiling the whole time because Milad said, "I hope my comments resonate," and I wanted to say, I swear I didn't read your talks before. I'm not creeping on your laptops, but anyway, so there's a lot of resonances, and I'm just so lucky to have Milad as a generous and, as you have all now seen, very eloquent intellectual interlocutor who continuously inspires my thinking. The only thing is I have to disagree with your timeline of when we met. What Milad might not remember is that we used to cross paths on Sproul Plaza as undergrads, I think well before either of us were anthropologists, but that's okay. Also, I really wanted to thank Esmaeil Haddadian-Moghaddam for his insightful book. It's been one of the books I referenced the most as I was writing my dissertation, and now the book. And yeah, I think sometimes when I feel like I'm, you get in your head and like, am I making this up? I go back to his book and I'm like, no, other people have seen this. And so the fact that there's this convergence of scholarship on translation, I think it's very exciting for one, but it also tells us we're onto something important. And I think, it's right, is that it gives us the opportunity to reframe given narratives of Iranian modernity, among other things. So thank you to Milad for the invitation and the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for the invitation to be here and for making it happen. So I wanted to begin by echoing sort of discourses that Milad also referred to. So journalists, academics, and politicians curious as to why nominally secular theory has flourished under a presumably illiberal Islamic state have suggested that ideas from the West are valued by Iranians because they can promote social change in Iran and therefore undermine the claims of Iran's theocratic regime. And these commentaries, like Western commentary, mirrors and corroborates the anxieties of the Iranian government because they suggest that pro-democracy movements in Iran and the Middle East more broadly result directly from activists' engagement with Western theory. And like one small example is there were like multiple articles, including in the New York Times, that cited the work of Gene Sharp as being seminal to the Green Movement and the Arab Spring. And also on the other side, Milad already mentioned the show trial of Saeed Hajjarian. So this is a narrative that flourishes on sort of both sides. These commentaries subscribe to what we might call a pinball model of social change, whereby ideas enter Iran from the West in a linear causal fashion and can explain the rise of democratic movements. However, to argue that texts travel because they have liberating effects on readers confuses effect with cause and overlooks the processes by which those texts are made available to readers. Such arguments also hinge on an underlying belief in the causal efficacy of texts, whereby the content of a text has an autonomous meaning that directly shapes the intellect of readers. My aim is to interrogate these assumptions and take the moment of transfer via publication and translation as the starting point for ethnographic inquiry. So like Dr. Haddadian-Moghaddam, I ask, how and why do certain works of Western social science, human sciences, versus others become available to and popular among Iranian readers? Who makes these books available to reading publics in the first place? And to answer this question, between 2012 and 14, I carried out 22 months of fieldwork tracing the material and social process of mediation through which translated texts are produced. And the overarching premise of the manuscript I'm working on is that translation is not just an intellectual or creative exercise, but a concrete social and material practice on the part of mediators who are embedded within the broader structures of knowledge production and political economy of the Iranian state. I approach translation through the lens of what I'm calling translation infrastructures. And I want to be clear, I'm not using infrastructure here merely as a metaphor. In the past decades, infrastructure has comprised a rich vein of anthropological research and provided a fruitful lens for studies of urbanism, especially in the global South. Anthropologist Brian Larkin defines infrastructure as, and I quote, networks that facilitate the flow of goods, people, or ideas and allow for their exchange over space. And really, even more simply, matter that enables the movement of other matter. Anthropologists have examined how the movement of matter on and through roads, electric grids, oil and gas pipelines have created new forms of society, politics, and temporality. In my work, I define translation infrastructures as those processes, institutions, networks, and social relations through which translations are produced and disseminated as book objects. Translations of Western theory do not reach readers through the ether. Rather, they do so as material artifacts produced via a dense network of cultural producers and state actors. And I focus in my work on translators, publishers, and censors, but it also includes printers and distributors who rely on hard infrastructure such as roads, the postal system, telecommunications infrastructure, and the national banking system for the production and dissemination of books. Even more importantly, translation infrastructures are the grounds through which key mediating figures, and again, translators, publishers, and censors namely, make crucial decisions about which books to select for eventual public consumption. Ethnographically, I paid close attention to these individual subjectivities, aspirations, and their relationships with one another in the process of book production. Ultimately, I reveal how these mediating figures work through and within translation infrastructures to disseminate various social imaginaries. And I'm here drawing on the work of Charles Taylor, but I'm not going to get into it because this is a very short presentation. Social imaginaries include those conscious and unconscious assumptions about the ideal operation of public spheres, especially, but also about the state and the market on the part of mediators. In the brief time I have left today, I want to focus on one aspect of the social imaginary of translators and its implications for the books that get produced through translation infrastructures. So as Milad has already noted, and it has been made sufficiently clear, translators have become increasingly important public intellectuals in Iran, and they play a central role in textual translation. This is what Dr. Haddadian-Moghaddam just said. So the question for me is, how then do translators envision the task of translation, and how does their understanding affect the circulation of ideas? I suggest that translation ideologies is a fruitful analytic for examining the relative positionality and politics of various approaches to translation in Iran and elsewhere. And by translation ideologies, I mean those ideas about translation that inform what, how, and why individuals translate. The result of those decisions and discourses also in turn work to further shape those ideologies. In my conceptualization, translation ideologies coalesce around different understandings of what a translated text is and what it does in society. And this effectively demonstrates that a number of seemingly disparate questions pertaining to the process of translation are in fact closely linked. What is the appropriate methodology for translation? What books should be selected in the first place? Who is the audience? What is the relationship of the translator to the text he or she produces? What is the end goal? While scholars of translations often treat, not always, but often treat the answers to these questions as independent elements of the translation process, My findings demonstrate that the answer to each of these inquiries are indeed consistent with various translation ideologies. So in the context of Iran, identify translation ideologies espoused by three ideal typical groups of translators in Iran that I identify, these are my own terms, as radicals, importers, and dialoguers. While the names are my own design, these internal consistencies between these groups highlight the existence of various competing ideologies that constitute a discursive field. Of course, Iranian translators are hardly monolithic. They approach, have come from different ethnic, socioeconomic, gender backgrounds, among others. Yet these broad differences, each articulated vis-a-vis their differences from the other, are clearly discernible in Iran today. So I want to very briefly outline these three groups. And for those more familiar with the context of Iran, I'll give reference to certain names that might help you sort of peg the discourses I'm talking about. Renowned translator Milad Odabaei best exemplifies Radical's project. And Esmaeil already mentioned his famed article, Tarjuma Tafakkur, translation thought. He has variously argued that translation is the primary form of thinking for Iranians, and that Iranians should select works for translation that help elucidate the gaps, fissures, and contradictions inherent in Iran's position in relation to the West. Radicals promote postmodern theories that highlight the space of lack in order to move towards an sort of emancipatory event a la Badiou. Since they insist on highlighting distance, accordingly, they employ a method of translation that preserves the foreignness of the text. And this is what translation studies scholar Lawrence Venuti has called a foreignizing approach to translation. They alter a sense of, they foster a sense of social alterity among their readers and supporters. Radicals contrast sharply with the second group, importers. Many of Iran's better known translators, such as Khashayar Dehimi and Azatollah Fudadvan, can be considered importers. Whereas radicals are concerned with preserving the distance between Iranian readers and foreign text, importers' goal is to decrease that distance or ideally make it disappear entirely. Importers seek to import Western theories into the Iranian context in such a way that preserves their relative value from their original Western context, even as they select texts based on their assessment of Iranians' present day needs. In doing so, of course, they presume the existence of a Western canon or tradition from which Iranians can draw on to meet their own intellectual needs. Secondly, for importers, translation is a medium that can bring about changes in thought and practice. And so they ascribe to that sort of causal efficacy of the text that I mentioned at the beginning. And while the varies widely, they're probably the most wide-ranging group in terms of textual selection. Many have devoted themselves to works of sort of classical liberalism. And they critique radicals for selecting texts that are not appropriate to Iran's historical moment. So as one importer told me, why would you translate Derrida or Lacan when we don't have Freud? And finally, this should be a little sort of, it follows, importers opt for domesticating translations that are smooth, readable, accessible, and give the illusion of transparency. Finally, dialoguers seek to create a dialogue between the Islamic and Western traditions as they see them. Rather than viewing translation itself as a solution to problems in Iran, as they have been formulated, addressed, or solved abroad, dialoguers are interested in translating those concepts, ideas that will contribute to existing social, cultural, and political debates in Iran, as well as create bridges between Iranian scholars and foreign ones. It's perhaps unsurprising that the vast majority of translators working out of Qom or under those who have clerical training, as Milad referenced, would fall into this group. Many have been inspired to translation through the works of Abdul Karim Surush or sort of at the direct mentorship or inspiration of Mustafa Malikian, right? People who are in conversation or have emerged from sort of conversations on Qom. They have a marked interest in works on religious pluralism, theology, hermeneutics, psychology, and political science. And methodologically, because their goal is to engage in dialogue, they seek to adhere to the source text as closely as possible. And they attempt really to preserve the phrasing of the original text. And this makes them a little more inaccessible than their texts a little more inaccessible than those produced by importers. I have a little, how are we doing on time? I have a little on publics, but I can just skip over a paragraph to give us more time. All right, I'm gonna skip a paragraph to give us time for conversation. I'm gonna go to my closing. So all I wanted to say is that these ideologies also have important implications for social imaginary. So how each of these groups are imagining their publics, but I will leave that aside. I'm happy to answer questions about it. All right, I'm gonna go to the end. Like language ideologies or other semiotic ideologies, the concept of translation ideologies enables anthropologists to nest the process of translation, which is at once both personal and abstract, within a broader host of social, political, and economic concerns. They also help us understand how social imaginaries become materialized through translation infrastructures. In other words, translation ideologies behoove us to recognize the ways in which people's use of translation both forges and reveals insights into the social and political milieu that enable certain kinds of ideas to circulate. So process of intertextualization. And in closing, I return to my opening point. These insights complicate pinball models of social change. Rather than ascribe agentive power to Western texts, thereby reinscribing the rest as a passive consumer of Western knowledge, and this is a very racialized image, as Milad also mentioned. Ethnography reveals that processes of mediation, which include translation ideologies, powerfully shape the movement of ideas. I will end there.
That was so wonderful. Milad, would you like to have a conversation? I have a couple of questions of my own. So if you want to carry on a conversation among yourself, that's totally fine. But if I can raise a couple of questions, that would be also, we can have a conversation about that.
I will be very quick, maybe just one question, and then we'll pass it on to you. Hosna, I should say that forgetting that we actually met during undergrad is part of my successful repression of my studies of engineering and my work as an engineer. So you absolutely reminded
I'm sorry.
me. Yes.
I'm so sorry to bring it up. I apologize.
Absolutely correct. I guess, by the way of connecting some of the threads that we put on the table, maybe we can begin by, Esmaeil, you already started speculating about why is it that translators in Iran have such an important visibility, and why do they have such a symbolic capital in your terms, by pointing to that there might be an absence or something invisible that motivating this. This has an echo in part of Hosna's presentation of radical translators, but I am wondering if I was going to answer that question of why is it that translator, and I would like you to further elaborate on that and answer for yourself, but if I was going to connect it with what I said in the beginning, I would say that in my works, translation of social and political theory is part of very novel enactment of modern society in Iran, right? So ideas are part of, to use Hosna's word, infrastructure of modern society, and in order to enact what we understand as society, modern states, which have emerged in the long array of these political forms of European history towards political and socio-political developments and discursive developments. In Iran, they emerge by the way of translation. Now, this translation has a very complex dynamic. I was trying to say it's not simply a mimetic emulation of Europe, but also makes a transferential relationship to Iranian history possible. But it is the lack of discursive traditions internal to Iran. And this is why I believe that certain invocations of Persianate discourses or Islamic discourses risk being reactionary by making these total discourses as opposed to historical ones. It's the lack of those discursive traditions that is related to practices of translation. So translation is a welcoming of difference, of alterity, in order to create something radically new. I'll stop there. You're muted. Sorry.
Right. I haven't given much of the thought about this, to be honest, but it seems to me it ties it very well with two things. First, I think is ties in with Murat God, I forgot his name. Farhad Pour's articles about tafakkur and tarjumeh, because I mean, simply put, he says that we have to translate everything for ourselves. Means we have to digest, in a way, the modernity in order to produce something which is local, which is made by us. We have to translate Mullah Sadra. We have to translate this and that. This is one thing. And then the other thing is the idea that translators, especially literary translators, have such a high prestige. Why is it that? And I've been thinking a little bit about this, not really seriously, to be honest, but it came to my mind that there might be a simple reason for this. The reason, again, has to do with modernity and its failure or success in Iran. And then during the course of your presentation, and Hosna, it came to my mind that I'm not sure how long this visibility of literary translators and translation sustains in Iran. For how long this is going to be the case. Translators, as we know, are not so visible in the Western translation tradition. It seems to me they are more visible in developing countries or in societies in transition, because most of our intellectuals, in general terms, have done translation on the side. Jalal al-Ahmad did a lot of translation, regardless whether or not they were faithful or not. Zabiullah Mansouri was a prolific translators, adapters, pseudo-translators, and they gained fame. So they were filling a gap of the intellectuals. In the absence of serious intellectual who could think about modernity as its application to the Iranian case, we have translators who substitute those people. So translators with a little bit of knowledge of a foreign language, with a little bit of talent and experience, they gradually fill the gap. And of course, we know, because of serious problems that we had in Iran, either during the Pahlavis, even in the post-revolution time, the problem of lack of freedom of speech and other problems that we all know, the project of modernity has not completely been successful, yes? So as long as that problem exists, I think the translators in Iran will continue to enjoy a certain amount of prestige. So this relationship, I think, can tell us why that's the case. The translator in Iran enjoy that position, whereas in a modern society, in a Western tradition, in a Western country, I'm not saying that that is the ideal case, but in a typical one, translators don't have that prestige and position. So translation is one way of understanding the problem of modernity in Iran, its success and its failure. That, I think, what is I would like to just add to the discussion is something that we could think about that. And I found the division of translator in Iran into three groups of radicals and importers, and I think it was dialoguers, quite fascinating. But I'm not sure to what extent, for example, we can put Murad Farhadpour in the group of radicals, those who are strictly following Venotti's idea of foreignization, because the idea of foreignization then brings to the mind the idea of free literal problem of translation. This is a serious problem that we have in Iran. how should we translate, free or literal? Then we go back to idea of Lafgrai that put forward by Khazayfar, and then we come to Dehimi that Hosna referred to. These are, of course, the opposite of foreignization, but I'm not sure if in Iran we can apply the idea of a foreignizer translator. I don't think that we have anything like that, because that kind of person does not score very well in the market. People want to read readable translation, and readable translation is against foreignization. So I'm not sure about that categorization, but still I found it very fast, very innovative way of looking at the translator. So I stop at there and I listen to what you have to say.
We're out of time, but maybe Hosna can respond very briefly. You are muted.
I'll try to keep it brief because I know we're over time, but I think there's multiple questions embedded in your question, Milad, because I agree that translation, sort of attention to translation, grows out of this long array of engagement with Western texts since, even prior to the Constitutional Revolution. At the same time, a question for me is like, why is there so much more attention to translation afforded, both right in terms of capital or attention or whatever after the revolution? And so here I think, like all history, and I risk sounding like a combination of Weber and Marx, is like there's also some contingency that comes into play. And so I've thought about this a lot, and I always feel like I'm missing something. So I'm really excited to be talking to you all. But there's, at least really off the top of my head, 3 things that I think have contributed to this. And then I want to subvert the question entirely. So bear with me for a second. First, I think, obviously, after the revolution, there is an absence of intellectuals, right? Like both in terms of sort of the vacating of the left, both like in terms of immigration, and some get killed during the revolution. And then also with the closing of the universities and the continued brain drain that we've seen, right? Many of Iran's important intellectuals, even of the 90s, live abroad today. And so there is an absence of people who are writing original sources. So that's a fairly simplistic sort of historical event. But I think that's also coupled with Iranian intellectuals at the turn of the revolution and following the revolution that were engaging in what we might call cultural translation. And I feel iffy about that term, but encouraging translingual forms of translation. So people like Shariati and Surush encouraged, people who engage with them to actually read original sources. And because the vast majority of Iranians do not read English, they became a push, and a lot of their students or people who are inspired by them were sort of drawn to translation, which then sort of hits against like the third historical contingency I see, which is the rise of a robust publishing industry following the revolution. And this is something I'm really interested in, In the 90s, all of these publishers at the end of the war begin popping up, and the economy is such that they're able to produce text on a large scale. They're not producing text at those numbers today, but it's the institutionalization of certain forms of material production and circulation that didn't exist before the revolution. So that's like some answers, maybe. But I also really want to subvert this question entirely, because partially this question is premised on the idea of a translation as a non-intellectual interlocutor, And like, what I mean by this is like, you and I, we've both been to classes offered by Farhad Pur, and I don't know that his gloss on Western philosophy is any less intellectual, interesting, or insightful than classes that I've taken at Berkeley, which is to say, it presumes, the question presumes that a translator is intellectually vacuous in a way that I think our ethnographic findings really complicate too. So I answered it, and then I kind of tossed it up, but there we are.
Well, thank you so much. This is so fascinating, and many questions are still there, and you all 3 need to promise that at some point we come back to this topic and continue this very important conversation, and which is also very near and dear to me, so we need to end it here, but hopefully very soon Milad would organize another panel, maybe a larger panel, maybe even a symposium on translation, and we can have you in person in Princeton and also show you our Princetonian hospitality. So thank you so much, Milad, for convening this, and Esmaeil and Hosna, and hope to see both of you in person sometime soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.